The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to ReproAction's monthly Act and Learn webinar for the month of October. Today, we are talking about who is behind attacks on DEI, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as you might expect, anyone who is against those things is also against abortion rights and justice, social justice generally. But we will be laying out exactly what DEI is and what's the end game of those trying to dismantle workplace DEI initiatives and protections. We're so happy to have you with us to discuss a topic that is not only very timely, but has been bubbling up in waves in the news in other ways over the past year or so, a bit more, and not always for the best reasons. I'll also note up top that this topic is going to delve into research and messaging and conversations related to the upcoming election, but ReproAction hopes everyone gets out and votes because that is a cornerstone of the democratic republic we are in. But we do not take any organizational positions on any candidates or races. But I'm getting ahead of myself and teasing more than I need to up top. So let us get into the substance of our conversation today. So if you missed us last month, you wouldn't have heard me before, most likely. So the first voice you are hearing is me. I'm Shireen Shakori, Executive Vice President and Chief of Staff of ReproAction. I use she and her pronouns, and I am based in Washington, D.C. You can find me every now and then on Twitter, but I decided not to tag myself here. I usually would, but I'll kick it over to Liz to introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Saski. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Development and Operations Director at ReproAction, and I am in Westchester, New York today.
Amazing. Thank you, Liz. Let's see if the screen advances now. Okay, I'll give you a bit of our agenda, what we are looking at today. So first, we are introducing ReproAction. That is what's about to happen. Then Liz is going to give you an overview of DEI in practice and some of what I was discussing about the attacks on it. Then we're getting into a really exciting panel with Shawnie Hawkins, Director of the Workplace Equity Program at HRC Foundation, and Dhanaraj Thakur, who is Research Director at the Center for Democracy and Technology, talking about some of his research there. Then we'll go into next steps to plug in and get activated more, and a moderated Q&A at the end. If you have questions while the speakers are talking or while Liz is presenting the topic, there is a question box in the corner of your screen in the GoToWebinar panel, and we will get to as many as possible at the end. So you can type them in whenever, as soon as you think of them. You don't have to wait. And if you want to join the conversation online, if you are a tweeter, then we are tweeting out some quotes from today's broadcast at the hashtag ReproAction. So a bit more about us before we get into the topic. If you're new, ReproAction leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We bring to that movement building a left flank analysis and a willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they are traditionally viewed as allies or our opposition. We also bring a commitment to nonviolent direct action that grounds our work. So I will kick it over to Liz to give us more about the topic. What is DEI?
Great, thank you. So this is going to be probably a review for a lot of people, but just to go back to the basics, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's the idea, it's all the simple concepts that promote respect and support for all people, their potential, differences, and their different needs. So what can DEI look like in the workplace? Equal pay for equal work, fighting biases in hiring, supporting employees from marginalized background, educating all employees about respect and what that looks like, and dealing with conflict, and training employees to unlearn unconscious bias and stereotypes that they might have. So we've seen it, DEI is the set of values, and it's in the workplace is usually a specific department or a group that organizes initiatives and trainings around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the attacks on DEI can target the departments that are the people in those departments that are leading the DEI work, or just really the goals of DEI initiatives in general. So something that's really important to remember as we talk about the attacks is that DEI is a set of values. It's not really like a tangible thing necessarily, but it's more of an idea that you're trying to build into this workplace, and it has a very positive impact on a company's programs, policies, and practices. The unfortunate thing we've seen really quickly is that as soon as the DEI initiatives kind of got started in a lot of workplaces, there was a big pendulum swing. And recently, according to CNN, they had a quote after a 29% uptick in job postings with DEI in the title or other descriptions between November 2020 and November 2021. The data shows a more than 23% decline in the amount of job postings with DEI in the title or description between 2022 and 2023. So it was really like a whiplash of companies getting on board with DEI and then almost immediately swinging back the equilibrium and dropping it. So we can go to the next slide. But that doesn't mean it doesn't improve the workplace. Just because there's a tax on it doesn't mean it's not valuable, of course. The education reduces ignorance and fear of those that are different than us. It lets us confront and challenge biases that we might not even know we have, and thus reduces discrimination. It produces a culture of respect in the workplace, and even with disagreements, there's very clear ways to work through them or get to the heart of the matter. And focusing on DEI initiatives provides great access to opportunities for members of marginalized groups who have historically not had such access. And it's just a smart business practice. Surveys have shown that from LGBTQ consumers to just diverse consumers want these DEI initiatives. People will boycott those that end the DEI initiatives. Companies with more diversity are more likely to outperform other companies, and companies with the least diversity underperform other companies. So minimizing DEI in the workplace is what we're talking about today. So the attacks on DEI can take many forms. We talked about it before, accusing members of marginalized groups of being undeserving of their success or not being the best person for the job. The rhetoric they like to use is a DEI hire, minimalizing and mocking the successes of people who they don't see as necessarily deserving a certain position. Reducing workplace DEI initiatives to quotas that employers are meeting. And this again suggests that someone only got the job because of their identity. And then skepticism that DEI work is important and necessary. There's this kind of desire to not acknowledge difference and privilege, and this constant pointing to this idea of we're supposed to be in a post-racial society, we're in a colorblind society, so we don't need DEI initiatives. And we've seen a lot of attacks on DEI recently. Governor Ron DeSantis banned the use of federal funds in public colleges in Florida and shuttered the DEI office at the University of Florida. Ford has stopped participating in the HRC's Corporate Equity Index after being considered one of the best places for LGBTQ people to work in past years. We've seen Harley Davidson shut down their DEI program and the possibility of not sponsoring Pride events. And many of these decisions came after conservative activist Robbie Starbuck launched campaigns online against DEI initiatives. So it's important to trace that line between who is starting these conversations and then how it's trickling up into the business practices. And continuing, who is fueling the attacks on DEI? Unsurprisingly to everyone, far-right extremist agitators are really spearheading these attacks with goals that go far beyond individual workplaces. We're seeing it trickle into classrooms with what teachers are allowed to teach or curriculum instruction, and trying to get things that discuss racism or sexism out of the curriculum. We're seeing books being banned that depict BIPOC characters or LGBTQ lives. In 2023, the far right introduced at least 65 bills to limit DEI in higher education in 25 states, and 8 of those bills became laws. And these extremists are fighting government trainings on racism and sexism, even in workplaces they weren't a part of, to just justify the attacks on those groups. And then just continuing this, the continued claims from the far right, the idea that DEI programs promote undeserving, quote unquote, people, that they're only looking to check a box. There's a lot of conversation around what they're calling identity politics and the weaponization of the term DEI, basically using it against any idea or policy that they may disagree with. The conversations on race and gender equality are anti-American. And we even saw in 2020 the executive order from Trump that banned federal entities and contractors from providing employees with training on, quote, diverse concepts and, quote, harmful ideologies related to race and gender. I'll pass it back over to Shireen.
Thank you so much, Liz. Yeah, before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to thank you for laying that out, and particularly the through line between people being interested in attacking DEI, not even because they care that much about what's happening in their own workplace or the workplaces of people they might know, but this has much bigger, scarier goals connected to far right policy making and culture change. So with that, I do want to introduce our speaker who is super versed in this topic and can expand upon that more. Shawnie Hawkins, SHRM CP, Director of Workplace Equity Program at HRC Foundation. She has been an advocate and educator on LGBTQ+ workplace inclusion for over 15 years. In this role with HRC, she is responsible for managing key corporate and constituent engagement programs, namely educational resource development, training, ongoing communication platforms, and multimedia projects addressing current and emerging LGBTQ+ subjects for advancing workplace inclusion efforts. Before joining the foundation, she worked in the corporate space as a human resources business partner and as a leadership development professional, designing and implementing training curriculums for organizations across multiple industries like retail and telecommunications. Rashawn holds a BS from the University of Iowa and has a Leading in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion certificate from Northwestern. Thank you so much, Shawnie, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I will hit our first question. Liz mentioned before the idea of this pendulum swing against DEI. Could you expand on how the push for more conversations and focus on DEI began?
Yeah, you know, I think like there is a longer history around just addressing systemic injustices within our country. And so you can really kind of trace roots back of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and programs really around the beginning of the civil rights movement in the mid-60s. When we think of the Civil Rights Act passing in 1964, that was addressing historic injustices for folks of color, specifically Black Americans, around voting, around housing, around education, and around employment. And so there were needs then to create initiatives and programs to address that gap in access and equity with all of those sort of key pillars of being a functioning member of society as our society is created. In the most recent history, I think what we saw, especially in like the corporate space, through the emergence of social media and through you know, the first few years of the pandemic, we really saw a lot of companies paying more attention to social justice issues. And what we really kind of saw in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, was a lot of commitment, a lot of public commitment, especially through employers and corporations, to address those systemic injustices and to showcase a lot of their efforts through, you know, the concept of DE&I. And I think what we've seen a lot that you all have so wonderfully teed up this conversation with is that, you know, this isn't necessarily a new concept, but it is a new tactic or new wedge being used by, you know, extreme views within the country to sow more sort of division and discourse. So we've really kind of seen those kind of happen in that space. And so in this most recent 4 years, I think when, referring to the pendulum swinging, I think in the position that I have here at HRC leading our corporate equality index and our workplace equality program, we've been out in the field, for over 2 decades, putting a blueprint out there, consulting and shaping workplaces to be more inclusive for LGBTQ plus folks. And, every handful of years of progress, we see a bit of resistance as the pendulum swings further towards progression. And so I think what we have kind of seen in this most recent sort of evolution or era of DEI practices and concepts is a lot of companies really started or doubled down on DEI initiatives in that summer of 2020. And so their roots haven't been fully grown deep into their business operation and models. So when they're facing negative headwinds that we've seen over the most 2 recent state ledge cycles that you mentioned, Ron DeSantis in Florida, you've got Governor Abbott in Texas that have dismantled affirmative action in higher ed. Now we're seeing the next iteration and chapter of that coming into workplaces. And those sort of fair weather companies have faltered in those turbulent headwinds.
Thank you for that. And I really like you ending on the concept of fair weather accolades to DEI, because to your points and what Liz was saying before, it seems hard to argue against what DEI offers to workplaces: better worker satisfaction, which presumably means retention, better output as far as like business cases. It seems pretty obvious, but can you name more specifically what has fueled the pushback, and particularly what accelerated the pace of it over the past few years?
Yeah, I think that there is a shifting demographic shift in our country holistically. We're having more populous younger generations. So we'll start with, my generation. I'm an elder millennial. So when we look at census reporting, especially with millennial and Gen Z, these 2 cohorts of Americans specifically are more out and allied than ever before. And so we're seeing a shift in how people are identifying in community, and it's tricky. It is trickling into workplaces. Folks are seeing more representation in media, again through social media and the boom of that in the most recent decade and even most recent 5 years of connectivity. LGBTQ plus folks aren't isolated as much as they were before, where having groups being separate and not being able to find themselves even in the most rural pockets of our country, they're finding community online. They're finding community in maybe a neighboring town. So they're feeling more empowered to be visible and to be, a part of society, which is great. But that also puts fear into a lot of folks who have historically held a lot of power and who are still trying to keep power. And we see that through the intersection of all of these issues. So, I'm representing the LGBTQ plus aspect of the attacks on diversity and inclusion. But like you mentioned, and what we're all kind of here for, that extends into body autonomy and reproductive health. That stems a lot of transphobia that we're seeing within our country and across state and federal policies being in place, is really where we're seeing the most increased ramp up. And how we kind of see it here at HRC is, as we're seeing more and more visibility and more progress, we've got LGBTQ plus folks and trans folks in office, in elected office. We're seeing them on TV. They're the music that we're listening to, you're really seeing it immersed and normalized in day-to-day life. And there are still, folks within our country who are threatened by that freedom and visibility. And so some of those folks who are, still holding power, that still have those same extreme views on, a lot of stereotypes and tropes that are creating this sort of division and misinformation about what DEI does. like y'all mentioned in the opener, it being really used as like a bit of a dog whistle or coded language for um, uh, saying that someone who fits a demographic that isn't white, cis, and male is unqualified to have positions of power within this country. And so I think that's what we're kind of seeing, this outward sort of view. And unfortunately, in the tech boom that we have as a society, everyone has a microphone now and a soapbox. And so some of these voices are just a bit louder than others and are claiming more space. And we can't ignore the political climate that we are in as a country and as a nation that just helps keep this sort of rhetoric current in the media, and is why it's very much top of mind for everyone right now. I hope that answered it a little bit for you, but
No,
I think what I can impress upon this is that it's really kind of nothing new. You know, if we're thinking about the 60s, like I mentioned before, with civil rights and some of the other social justice issues that stem from, you know, those decades going forward. Anita Bryant was out here saying the same sort of rhetoric around homosexuality and LGBTQ plus people back in the 60s that we're hearing Robbie Starbucks of the world reiterating today.
No, I think your point was incredibly salient and definitely answers the question. I'm reminded of something I think one of my coworkers has said frequently, which is that the right wing thinks intersectionally all the time. They will never call it that, but they know that all of the issues that affect equity and justice in our society are deeply, deeply interconnected. And they know when they attack one, they can use it as that dog whistle to, or a catch-all to attack all the others. So no, I think you hit the point perfectly. Last question formally for you, and then any more we can save for the Q&A at the end. But how can individual employees within their own workplaces push to begin or continue a focus on DEI?
Yeah, you know, I think it's important to understand what your organization's missions and core values are. I will say that language has always evolved over time, and it will continue to evolve as, you know, human civilization walks the earth. So, you know, when you look at your organization's history in DEI, it might not all sound the same. You know, affirmative action is how it started in the 60s. You know, diverse training initiatives, you know, between the 60s and 70s. The real evolution of calling it diversity, equity, and inclusion is really a more modern twist and concept on it. So I wouldn't get fully held up on the DEI of it all, but making sure that your organization has intentional pathways and programs to meet the core values of what diversity, equity, and inclusion are trying to do. And that's really just addressing the systemic discrepancies that happen here. You know, I talk about this pretty frequently, and I was talking to one of my colleagues earlier today. And so I hope this like sort of visual helps. You know, when we're thinking about workplace, we really want everyone to have a fair shot to be successful to whatever their definition of success is. I think we all can really agree with that. So if you're coming from that place, then use that lens whenever you're being critical or analyzing a process, a program, or initiative that your employer may be doing. But when you think about equality, like I don't want folks to get like stuck on the semantics of language, because like I was talking to my colleague earlier, we're talking about equality. You know, Shay, I'm a famous shoe manufacturer, and I want to give everyone that comes to my shoe warehouse a pair of shoes. Everyone gets one pair. That's equality. But all the pairs are a size 10. So only people who can fit a size 10 will that shoe be a benefit to. Other folks may need something additional to make that shoe comfortable. The equity of the situation is giving everybody a pair of shoes, but allowing them to get the shoes that fit their need. And that's really all what DEI is trying to do. So when we can get away from, you know, the misinformation and the social rhetoric around, you know, DEI is somehow replacing qualified people with underqualified. That's just truly not the case. The exact opposite is the point and intention on that, is to make sure that the very best have an opportunity to showcase their skill sets in any work environment that's applicable. And so I think like that's how individuals can kind of start. Really just root yourself in what your organization's policies are. Remember the definition of DEI that you learned at the top of this call, and really just kind of center things around that, because it really is just creating equity for everyone to achieve the goals that they desire.
Thank you so much. Anyone who has questions for Shawnie, make sure you put them in the question box, and I will move to our next panelist in the meantime. Let's see, there we go. We have next speaking with me is Dhanaraj Thakur, who is the research director at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where he leads research that advances human rights and civil liberties online. Over the last 15 years, he has designed and led research projects that have significantly informed tech policy and helped improve the way public policy problems are framed. He's been interviewed for his work and quoted in several news media, including Wired, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, The Guardian, and Financial Times, among others. In addition, he has published over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers. He is currently a member of the Technology Policy Research Conference Program Committee and the advisory board of She Persisted, a former Fulbright Scholar, Inter-American Development Bank Scholar, ISOC Ambassador. Dhanaraj previously led research at the World Wide Web Foundation, focusing on broadband access and affordability, gender equity online, and open data. Prior to that, he was a member of the political science faculty at Tennessee State University and the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica. He holds a PhD in public policy from Georgia Institute of Technology and is a graduate of London School of Economics, University of the West Indies, and the University of Technology in Jamaica. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really excited to get started. I'm going to ask first, based on your research, how has DEI manifested as a far-right flashpoint?
Great, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction, Shireen. And really great to hear the points that were made earlier by Liz and Shawnie. So with regard to your first question, okay, so the context that I want to maybe bring us to is the elections, and maybe highlight some of our recent research on this area with regard to your question around DEI and as a far right flashpoint. So one of the realities with Congress, for example, is that women of color are underrepresented in Congress, but actually across various levels of policymaking and government throughout the country. In 2020, we saw the highest increase in the number of women of color candidates running for Congress, highest in history, but those numbers have since declined. It would decline in the 2022 elections, and we also see lower levels compared to 2020 in next month's elections. So there are lots of reasons for this, but I think the one I want to highlight in particular is this kind of pushback against this notion around DEI, which both Liz and Shawnie talked about in different contexts, but here I think it becomes particularly important because we are talking about Congress and the making of laws that impact everyone in this country. So, for example, when we studied this online context, when we studied the kinds of posts that were being targeted at women of color political candidates back in 2020 on Twitter, we found that they were twice as likely to be targeted with disinformation compared to other candidates. They're 4 times as likely to be targeted with violent, sexist, and racist posts. And when we spoke to some of these candidates, women of color candidates themselves, they said that they were being targeted precisely because they're women and women of color who are mothers, immigrants, and so on. And it was hardly ever about their policies. So specifically around their identities based on race, gender, and other identities that became the focus of the people that were targeting them. And the aim they felt was often that these people were trying to push them out of politics. Trauma was the word that they often used to describe this kind of experience. We found a similar pattern in this election, in 2024 election, where we found that 1 in 5 tweets, again on X, 1 in 5 tweets targeting women of color candidates, specifically Asian American and African American women candidates, contain offensive speech. And more specifically, African American women candidates were targeted 4 times as much hate speech compared to other women of color candidates, 7 times as much as men of color, 3 times as much as white women, 18 times as much as white men. So all these kinds of statistics, and and we're not the only group that does this kind of research. There's several others that point to this problem. These statistics are evidence of a significant kind of pushback against the modest increases that we're seeing in representation by women of color, particularly in Congress. This pushback brings significant hate and vitriol online. And some of the examples that we identified and that other researchers have identified are particularly really horrific and terrible. As I mentioned, some of the candidates use the word trauma to describe their experiences navigating this. But the aim is always the same, to undermine the candidacy of these women and maintain a status quo where they are underrepresented in government. And it's driven most often, these attacks against perceived changes or perceived changes in representation and around DEI. It's driven, as I mentioned, by misogyny and patriarchy. And one last point on this is that those factors, I think, creates this kind of illusion among these often men that are pushing this kind of hate speech online, creates this illusion for them that their value or self-worth is predicated on undervaluing women and women of color in society, and particularly those running for office. And I think that illusion among these some of these men creates a vicious cycle that leads them to never fully in what it can really mean to be a man. So I would argue that even they lose out as well when we see this pushback against DEI.
Thank you. Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. This is all related to cis white patriarchy, and part of why we as an abortion rights and justice organization were so interested in this topic is the clear through line of patriarchy and control into this topic, and how the goals of those calling women of color candidates, DEI congresswomen, whatever, the whole goal is shunting them out of the public view and back into the home, if that at all. So yeah, thank you for drawing that line. Our next formal question, what are some easy ways to push back if someone argues harmful falsehoods about DEI initiatives? Things like, we don't need DEI, just hire / elect the most qualified candidates, etc.
Yeah, I think Shawnie's answer to the related question was quite good as well. But here I'll come back to the context of elections. I mean, so I think the kind of logical or answer that might appeal to people who think along those lines or on a moral level is that we know having representation from different communities in decision making, particularly around the development of public policy, actually makes policy better. And there's lots of research that shows this. Different candidates are able to bring their perspectives and perspectives of their communities to the table when it comes to creating legislation. And this is important because we're talking about a democracy. So I'm not talking about a company or a corporation or a small group of people. We're talking about a democracy, a representative democracy. That is what we have here. And so it's important that different perspectives are brought to the table. But if we have systems in place that prevent that, such as what I was describing to what's happening to a lot of these candidates online, or just makes it harder for them to participate in representing politics, whether that's lack of funding or other kinds of problems, then we undermine this entire experiment around democracy. There's also this business case, which depends on the context, and as someone mentioned this earlier as well, that can work with or be better received by some people. But what I would argue is that where we have a business case around ensuring like diversity and inclusion, this has to be baked into many of the technologies we use. For example, this idea that we don't need DEI, we just hire the most qualified candidates could be a kind of logic that's embedded in technologies that we use. And what I want to bring our attention to is that currently many companies use technologies like AI, machine learning tools to scan resumes or make decisions about which candidates to include in a hiring process. And if those technologies assume that we don't need DI, just hire the most qualified candidates, you end up with the wrong set of candidates. So those tools can actually undermine candidates, so candidates with disabilities or others, for example, which could then mean lost talent for those companies, and you could therefore lose the most qualified candidates. Yeah, and related to that, I think generally the idea that we don't need DEI or racism is over or whatever, our attempts to pretend that race and gender don't mediate how we interact with each other, which is clearly not how society works.
Absolutely, that is not how our society works, nor should it. A last formal question, and once again, if folks have additional ones, please throw them into the chat box. But what role does intersectionality have in understanding pushback against DEI, for example, in elections?
Yeah, sure. So, the underrepresentation I'm talking about, particularly like in Congress, but also other levels of government, is not binary. So we know that women are less likely to be represented in government. We've never had a woman president, for example, perhaps not yet. But the gap is more stark when we talk about women of color. That's borne out in like the numbers that you can look at in Congress, for example, but in other state legislatures and elsewhere. So in that sense, the challenge for these candidates to exist online is more difficult than others. So politicians have to be online, not just for their campaigns, right, but they have to connect with their communities and their constituencies. And so it's important to have that we ensure that there's healthy and safe communications between politicians and their constituencies. That's just a critical part of our democracy. But if some groups of candidates, if some types of candidates are less likely to enjoy that kind of communication, then we are undermining the democratic experiment. And so this notion of intersectionality allows us to recognize that there are multiple forms of oppression that people can be subject to based on their multiple identities, and many of us hold multiple identities, if not all of us. These multiple identities then can become targeted with various kinds of attacks, and this was borne out in a lot of the research that we did, but many other people have done as well. It's not a novel concept, as many people have alluded to, some of the previous speakers have alluded to. But this is critical because it allows us to determine where are the weakest links in our democracy and which groups need more support or require support in order to ensure their effective representation. And the examples I've been pointing to here in some of this research is on women of color because they are underrepresented, which is a problem that's very important that needs to be addressed. And so, I mentioned that earlier, that when it comes to offensive speech and hate speech in the current election that we're looking at, women may be more targeted than men, but women of color are more likely to be targeted than white women and much more likely than white men. So the point of intersectionality is then it's just to move beyond the kind of simple ways of understanding how gender and race intersect among many other identities, but to look at much more nuanced ways in which people identify themselves, and particularly when it comes to representation in politics, what that implies for potential harm, but also possibilities to improve our democracy.
Thank you for that. You brought up something that I'm gonna ask a follow-up question on, taking moderator privilege here. You were mentioning how candidates of color, especially women of color, have to be online. I'm thinking about how like the whole point of needing more people of color in positions of power is that they don't have the access to that power. Being online, being a presence is what for many of them probably helps get around not having access to the traditional channels of, fundraising, of power generation. Is that something you've seen in your research, where when people who are facing these types of attacks online retreat, and their grassroots fundraising or access to public platforms and ability to get their message out is then impacted by their retreat for their safety?
So I would say that in thinking about the candidates that we interviewed and spoke to in our research, I wouldn't necessarily say they retreated. The term that they, or I guess what I describe it as more as resilience, because what they had to do was to modify their campaign strategies online, not just for them, but their entire campaign teams, right? Their teams that were supporting them, in order to better address and push back against these kinds of attacks. So that would require more resources, more time, and just makes the overall experience much more difficult. But they did not drop out of the campaign or the contest, running for their particular seat. It did make it much more difficult. But they, in the conversations that we have, but also in other research, the role of social media for them acts as this kind of double-edged sword. So some scholars have, one in particular, Lucian de Mecca, has referred to it in that way, in that they have to be online and they have to be present, because that's just how politics works now. But for some candidates, women of color in particular, it becomes a means of attack through which many other people target them. So they just have to come up with more strategies. They require better resources, better coordination than say others who are less likely to be attacked, like white men. The challenge there is that this is the same group of candidates who are also less likely to get resources from their own political parties and less support from their own political parties, even though they are a group that may more likely need it, given the kind of online environment they exist in. If that makes sense, hopefully.
It does, and I appreciate hearing that it is a story of resilience and not necessarily retreat, so thank you for that correction. I am so grateful for our two speakers today. I'm going to go into a couple quick plugs, and then we will go to questions. So if you want to learn more about ReproAction and our campaigns, we are at ReproAction pretty much anywhere you can find organizations like us on social. Our website is reproaction.org. And save the date for our next webinar. We are looking at abortion care and access in 2025. So obviously what's happening in the next couple of weeks is going to determine a lot of that, but also some of that is just the groundwork that's been laid over the past year, what the care landscape looks like for the coming year. And now I am going to move on to our Q&A. We have two, I'll say more like comments so far. One is from William. Your slides would be excellent tools for a handful of our electeds who are engaged in a pre-session work group to lay out pretextual foundation to attack DEI programs in state hiring and university admissions. That's very interesting. Will you make your slides available for further distribution to our key allies? Yes, a recording of this session will be posted online probably tomorrow, so you can share this with whoever you want, as long as you are checking back on our YouTube channel or our website or signed up to our emails. Next, comment from Sarah, Governor Sarah, oh, not the same Sarah that is mentioned in this comment though. Governor Sarah Sanders in Arkansas has also enacted a number of initiatives against DEI, vocabulary mandates, education mandates, etc. Thank you. I think making the connection between what is happening in workplaces targeting DEI and as Liz was saying before, the banning of books, how various policies are described in our own spoken word and vocabulary, and also higher ed as well speaks to this bigger far-right strategy behind the attacks on DEI. Something our conversation brought up for me today is also the attacks accusing various figures in higher ed of plagiarism in ways that has often been extremely, exaggerated, not not in any understanding with how academia works. I'm thinking of Claudine Gay in particular at Harvard. And then most recently I saw, I think the president of University of Maryland was accused of plagiarism. And of course, these are both Black academics, and it seems very unlikely that the people who were making these accusations actually care about the credibility of the scholarly merit of these people's written works. It is all about who is in those seats, the power that holds, and shedding that power from people of color, and particularly Black people in positions of power. It's really damaging and concerning. I'm not seeing other questions. I will open the floor up once more to Shawnie or Dhanaraj if you have any comments on either of those 2 points that were made about making resources like this available to electeds, or the connection to school mandates, higher ed, etc. It's okay if not. Oh, great. We like to end promptly here at ReproAction, so I can end us early if there aren't any other questions. I am so grateful to our panelists' time today, Shawnie and Dhanaraj. You can find this recording hopefully tomorrow on our YouTube channel, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Bye.